US President Donald Trump will meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday for a high-stakes summit to discuss the war in Ukraine. President Trump has been upping the ante with his rhetoric around Putin in recent months. On the 14th of July, Trump set Putin a 50-day deadline to agree to a ceasefire with Ukraine. On the 28th of July, he reduced it to 10 to 12 days. As that deadline was reached last Friday, Trump announced plans for this summit. So why is this happening now, and what will be on the agenda? I mentioned all of these deadlines imposed by Trump in recent weeks. I mean, how is it a punishment for not meeting those deadlines that Trump is now inviting Putin for this summit?
Well, I think you've hit the nail pretty squarely on the head there, Anoosh. I mean, I think it's no great mystery from the Russian side why they might want to meet now. I think the question we should all be asking is why exactly the American side has agreed to this. But as you say, I mean, Trump has, in recent months, set these increasingly, it was 50 days and then it was 12 to 10 days and then it was definitely 10 days on the plane back from Scotland to the US. He said, okay, it's 10 days starting today. It's ceasefire or it's sanctions. And that was Friday. And then 2 days before that, his longtime golfing buddy turned special envoy, Steve Witkoff, flew to Moscow, met with Putin. And I think this is really kind of the crux of it. He seems to have emerged from that meeting. It's not clear whether he was misled or he just misunderstood. But he seems to have come away from that meeting with the sense that, okay, a really meaningful deal is now on the table. He seems to have reported back that Russia was potentially prepared to withdraw its troops from 2 of the regions that it claims. So there's 4 contested regions. Currently, if we set Crimea to one side, the proposal Witkoff seemed to think was on the table was that Russia would withdraw its troops from Kherson and Zaporizhia, 2 regions in the southeast of Ukraine, in return for Ukraine withdrawing from Donetsk. That seems to have prompted Trump then to give all of these statements saying that, something major is in the offing now. I think we can do a deal here. We're going to get some territory swapped for the betterment of both sides, although I think Ukrainians would take issue with that characterization. And then in the days that followed that, it all just fell apart. Witkoff, in a meeting with European leaders and crucially also Ukrainian officials, was challenged about exactly what Russia had agreed. It's not clear if he takes a note taker to these meetings. It's not clear if he was just going on his own recollection. But he, over the next 48 hours, then arrived at a state where actually what Russia seems to be offering is if Ukraine unilaterally withdraws from all of Donetsk, a region that it currently still controls at least a quarter of, Russia would be prepared to offer a ceasefire. So effectively to freeze the conflict at the current lines in exchange for all of Donetsk, which is in no way what he initially said. It's not clear if that's a serious offer on the table from the Russian side. But what it does seem to have done is get him this audience with Trump, which now, instead of these massive sanctions that was going to go in and he was going to, really make Putin pay and he was going to really read him the riot act. Instead of any of that happening on Friday, instead, as you say, Putin is on his way to America. He is getting a meeting with Trump, which in itself is sort of a diplomatic victory. He had been kind of in isolation, been treated as somewhat of a pariah. Now he's going to get the red carpet treatment with Trump. He's going to sit down with him in what will be presented, and probably fairly, as a meeting of equals, as the great powers, the leaders of the great powers, sitting down to do business with each other. So just getting the summit itself is a win for Putin. And then, he also gets this audience with Trump without Volodymyr Zelensky, as far as we know, to give him his side of this conflict and presumably impress upon him how reasonable his objectives are, and to try to convince him that, in fact, it's Ukraine, it's Zelensky that is the real impediment to peace here.
It's so interesting because in the piece that you've written for the New Statesman in the build-up to this summit, you outline how there was also confusion over whether or not Zelensky would, be one of the conditions for meeting with Putin, that he would have to be in attendance for Trump to meet Putin. He suggested that and then went back on that.
Yes. Yeah, I think there is also somewhat of a briefing war happening between various factions within the Trump administration. And, there are serious officials who've been working on this issue for a long time who I think will be similarly concerned that this summit is happening without any Ukrainian participation. So you saw it start to be floated that, in fact, Putin would need to agree to also meet with Zelensky if he was going to meet with Trump. But then Trump himself came out and said, no, I'm not too bothered by that. That would be, I'm going to sit in the room with Putin first, and then we'll talk about setting up the meeting with Zelensky. So Trump has sort of seemed to undermine the leverage that other parts of his administration are suggesting he has, which, let's remember, this is something Putin wants. So he could have gotten something in return. He could have said, as a precondition to any meeting with me, I need to see you're serious. So I need to see, it's not so long ago we were talking about this proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah, I need to see that you're serious. I need to see no further attacks on Ukrainian cities for 20 days. And then we can talk about sitting down. But just giving the summit and then sort of waving away any concerns that would... And Zelensky's in an impossible position here. He has signaled in recent days he would be prepared to travel to Alaska. He's been on these meetings with European leaders. But it really seems that Trump is minded to just negotiate this above his head, and then he's going to inform him. He's going to call him first afterwards as a mark of his respect for him. But, in a meeting that he has said is going to be discussing land swaps of Ukrainian territory, it just seems mind-boggling that you wouldn't at least have a preparatory meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, even if he's not going to be in the room with Putin. I think just even the symbolic meeting with Zelensky first as the president of the country that has been attacked, as the person who is in the position to discuss seriously, is there territory that Ukraine would be prepared to give up or at least set aside for a period of time? But none of that is happening. Instead, what's happening is Putin is coming to Alaska and he's getting his big summit with Trump.
Yeah. And what do you think Trump, wants to come out of this summit? He's already said that he's going to see what Putin has in mind and that in the first 2 minutes, I'll know exactly whether or not a deal can get done. But what kind of deal do you think he'd be looking to get done?
I think we've seen in the past couple of days some real expectation management beginning to happen. I think whereas last week Trump seemed to be sort of presenting this as there's a deal on the table, we could get this over the finish line. Yesterday, Monday, he started talking about this instead as a feel-out meeting, that he's basically going to get in a room with Putin and, quote, see what he has in mind, and that it might well be he's not serious and that he's prepared to walk away. And he has done that in the past. When he met with Kim Jong-un during his first term, they had one meeting that Trump seemed to feel went really well. And at the second meeting in Hanoi, Trump did cut it short. And he did say afterwards, sometimes you have to walk. So Putin will be going into the meeting knowing that there is a chance Trump does this, that this is part of the whole theatrics of statesmanship that accompanies this president. So there is a chance that Trump at some point in the summit pushes back his chair, walks away and says, I can't help you. But I think he seems to want the optics of meeting with Putin. I think all the evidence from his first term is that he really enjoys these meetings with powerful world leaders. I think this is one area that he and Putin agree that this is how the world works, that this is for the leaders of major powers to decide. This is how diplomacy and statesmanship are conducted. So I think it's not at odds with Trump's worldview that he's the most powerful man in the world. He can command an audience with anyone he chooses. And this sense that he seems to have that he is just such an innately brilliant deal maker that if he just gets one-on-one in a room with Putin, he'll be able to extract something that no other leader has. And just by the sheer genius of his ability to sense and close a deal, he can do something here that no one else has. But I think Putin is a very, very experienced both manipulator of people, manipulator of Trump personally, And he has a formidable diplomatic team behind him. The preparation for a meeting like this would normally be months long. It would be arguing over wordings of communiques. It would be, you wouldn't just put the two leaders in a room to just see what happens. You would have some sense of an outcome that you're working towards, whereas Trump seems to see the summit as the beginning of the process rather than something meaningful in its own right. So, yeah, I think it's striking that he also seems to now to be managing expectations that it's peace in our times on Friday and that they shake hands and something is agreed. But I think he wants the summit. He wants the optics. He has always insisted the only way this is going to get solved is him sitting down in a room with Putin. And Putin's very happy to go along with that. This suits Putin's interests too.
Yeah, and from what we do know, I mean, you talked about the talk of a land swap. I mean, you've reported in Ukraine before. I mean, is there any appetite for we just want this war to be over and we would be willing to concede some of the land in order for peace?
I think there are two separate aspects to this. I think there is consistent polling the last few months shows growing support for a negotiated end to the war. Mm-hmm. The first couple of years even, that people were asked the question, it was a majority of support to fight on, and fight until something that looked like a victory. I think there is a growing realization that that is not within reach and that this war is likely to involve some really hard political and moral choices. If there was a way to end this war on terms that left Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state with the ability to defend itself, with the ability to continue on a westward trajectory, to, for instance, join the European Union, to not take NATO membership one day totally off the table, but that basically leaves Ukraine in a position that it can defend itself, that it can secure its future, and that it can be independent of Russian influence. It would not be a popular decision, but you can see the way that Zelensky could make that argument. Mm. I think offering something that amounts to unilateral withdrawal with no security guarantees, no, I don't think that would be acceptable. I think for all of the very real exhaustion and suffering and terror of life in Ukrainian cities during this war, I think that would just be seen as then the fighting and dying to this point has been for naught, because Ukrainians have been through this before. I also covered the 2014-2015 conflict, and there were 2 rounds of deals that were meant to end that, and Russia came back stronger, took more of the country. So I think if it's a deal along the lines of what perhaps seems to be on the table of handing over territory Russia doesn't even control yet in Donetsk in exchange for a ceasefire, but without meaningful security guarantees, I don't think that's acceptable, because it just leaves, I'm sure Russia would like a break. It would like 12 months to rebuild its forces, very much like a reprieve from sanctions. It would very much like to get its economy going again. But unless there's some sort of meaningful recourse to what happens if Russia comes back and tries again, then this is just a pause before another attack, which also is the case for Ukrainians making the decision about whether a lot of Ukrainians are currently outside of the country, particularly women and children. Do you come back? Do you rebuild your life in Ukraine? Do businesses get back on their feet? Do foreign investors put their money into Ukraine? If this can all just happen again in a few months' time. So I think and unfortunately this is where Zelensky tried and failed to get this across during that Oval Office meeting with Trump and Vance that went so disastrously wrong.
Yeah.
This is the point that he was trying to make there, is we need some sort of security guarantees. So without that, without a commitment to, turn Ukraine into there's a lot of talk about the Israeli model, flood Ukraine with arms and have, there was talk of the coalition of the willing or some sort of multinational reassurance force in Ukraine. Unless we're talking seriously about that side of the arrangement, then I think this will be viewed largely as a pause. And also, I have traveled a lot around the Donetsk region. If you hand over all of Donetsk, including the part that's not currently in Russian hands, then Russia's right on the doorstep of Dnipropetrovsk, which is the main industrial hub. So I guess in British terms, it would be like then allowing the foreign army, like then within 100 miles of Manchester, or whatever is a very important industrial heartland in that country. If you allow Russia to march further forward, but without any meaningful deterrent to just coming back to try again, then you're just putting more of Ukraine within reach. Not to mention, just what happens to the people who are on that territory and the land that so many Ukrainians have fought and died to defend. So a long answer to your very good question of would this be acceptable? And I think unless it's accompanied by some sort of meaningful security guarantees, then no.
So we talked about this from Trump and Ukraine's perspective, but what does Putin want from this meeting? You've already said that, it's actually a coup for him to have got this summit agreed to in the first place.
Yeah, he certainly just the symbolism of coming to America, meeting with Donald Trump is huge for him. It shows his domestic constituency. It shows other sympathetic countries that he's in charge of this. He's managing this. It's not so long ago people were talking about him having made this catastrophic strategic blunder. So would countries like China, for instance, decide that the time had come to distance themselves from Putin? To which the answer was clearly a very resounding no. I think the number one goal from Putin's side has to be to placate Trump. He wants to get Trump off his back.
Mm-hmm.
As he looks out at the battlefield, there are very real concerns for Russia in terms of the domestic economy, which is clearly dramatically slowing. Interest rates, I think, are now at 21%. There are significant consequences to this at home, but I think he still would assess that he is winning, that Russia can withstand that pain certainly for longer than Ukraine. I think his theory has always been that he can stick this out for longer than the West, that the West is fickle. Western political cycles mean leaders come and go. Unity is temporary and easily fractured. So he can outlast the outrage from the West, and he can move ahead with what is a very important and long-held strategic goal, which is not allowing Ukraine to move out of his orbit and not allowing. He seems to have convinced himself that there is this Western-led project to turn Ukraine into what he calls an anti-Russia. And so as long as Ukraine is not under Ukrainian control, it represents this real threat on Russia's borders, that NATO could be there with its military bases right on Russia's border. So he wants to halt that. He wants to push that back. And he wants to reassert Russia's interests. He wants to be in a world where the great powers can veto, and he has a say in what happens, in what he considers as his near abroad. So I think, concrete terms in the short term, he wants to get around this problem of Trump losing patience with him and Trump threatening sanctions. His experience so far is that those threats have been empty because Trump has repeatedly threatened to do this. And he also knows that they're not costless for the American side, that if he does really go after Russian energy exports, that could well push up the price of oil and gas, which would have an impact here at a time when consumer prices are already increasing and in a country where he was primarily elected to bring the cost of stuff down. So you can debate how seriously Putin takes those threats from Trump. It's possible he would agree to something like, there's been a lot of talk about an air ceasefire and perhaps also an air and a sea ceasefire, which would actually do Putin some favors. I mean, Ukraine is increasingly striking further into Russia. It's attacking Russian military facilities, but also Russian energy facilities. Civilians in Russia are now starting to feel somewhat of the war coming home. If that goes away, if there's an air ceasefire, that takes away a potential political problem for Putin. It also, a primary tactic for Ukraine now is its very innovative use of drone warfare that has been really effective in slowing the Russian advances and making sure that they come at an extremely high cost. If there is an air ceasefire, Russia could still keep chipping away on the ground. It could still keep grinding forward in Donetsk, for instance. So that might well be quite palatable to Putin. And similarly, the sea ceasefire, Ukraine without a navy has succeeded in pushing the Black Sea Fleet out from its base and causing real problems for Russia there. So I think you could see movement on that, perhaps the air and the sea front. And that could also help, for instance, with grain exports from Ukraine if the maritime approach is secure. But I think that would give some respite, and it would certainly, I'm sure Ukrainians who are under Russian bombardment would welcome respite from that. But it'd be pretty different from an end to the war. So I think if Putin can get some of his military objectives met, he'll certainly take that. I think there's a political angle here where he wants to keep Trump on side. He wants to show that it's Zelensky who's the impediment here. So getting Trump's ear, his past experience with Trump has been that he is clearly very persuasive. I mean, I think we all remember the summit in Helsinki where in their press conference afterwards, Trump sided with Putin over his own intelligence agencies. So Putin has reason to be relatively confident that if he gets some time alone with Trump, that he can push his argument with him. And beyond that, I think it's just, we mentioned at the start that this is how both Trump and Putin see the world as working. One of the reasons Putin has never wanted to sit down with Zelensky is partly he doesn't want to give him that legitimacy, but he doesn't see Ukraine as a real actor here. He sees the United States as the actor, and not Europe either, incidentally, that it's going to be the US who is in a position to give on his main demands here. So I think he sees both political and military objectives that he would like to meet. But there's also nothing to lose. If he comes away from this, if Trump walks away, then he's back to where he was, which is fighting on slowly at a terrible cost in lives, but a cost that doesn't seem to bother Putin one iota. And with, I think the other element to this, and which makes the sort of claims of brilliant deal-making a little bit hard to credit, is Trump himself is describing this war as a loser, something he wants to get over with, a Democrat war, a Biden war. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, just this last weekend gave an interview saying Americans are done with funding the Ukraine war machine. So all of the signals that are coming from high levels in the administration here are the United States wants to get out of this. It's not that if it was a deal, some sort of serious progress, or guess what, I have this package that would incidentally be very easy to get through Congress. I'm going to send this massive new arms funding package through Congress, and we are going to arm Ukraine to the teeth. This is your last chance to do a deal on this. Maybe Putin would take that more seriously, but how this looks to Putin in Moscow is Trump hasn't followed through on any of his threats so far. He and his other officials are signaling repeatedly, we're done with this. We want to get away from this. We're not deeply committed either to Ukraine's sovereignty or these fundamental principles of territorial integrity. So why would he take anything other than a deal that broadly gives him at least some of what he wants?
Yeah, and you mentioned Europe, actually. I think it's interesting what you said, that Putin doesn't really factor, the European perspective in. I mean, what have EU leaders and Britain been saying about this upcoming summit? And is it falling on deaf ears, both in the US and Russia?
I think there's no real sign it's falling on receptive ears. Let's put it this way. But I mean, Europe does have agency, and as Ukraine has repeatedly shown, Ukraine has agency. And so I think this realization has seemed to come in fits and starts over the last 6 months. And one of the things Trump is, whatever you think of him, he's very clarifying in terms of the direction of US foreign policy. So I think if Biden was still in power and the American policy to Ukraine was still what it would be easy to sort of just chug along and keep up this sense of, we're all in this together and we can get round to our funding commitments as and when that's palatable domestically. I think what Trump is showing is the future of this conflict and of Ukraine and of European security. A lot of that's going to depend on the actions of European leaders. So I think if something comes out of this that is minus any security guarantees, then that's where at least Europe, Trump has said at least he's open to selling US arms. That is where money is going to have to be put where mouths are, and massive spending commitments are going to have to go in. That is what is going to deter Putin from coming back here, is if there's then this really serious effort to make sure that Ukraine is able to defend itself, that it does have really meaningful defenses along any line of contact in the future. I think we're looking at something potentially here that looks very much more like the post-Korean War model, where then the deterrence, which has held over 3/4 of a century now, is the cost of trying again. And in that model, that was backstopped by the United States, which still has troops there. I don't think there's any sense that that is on the table here. So this is then the space for Europe and European leaders. And I think, to be fair to individual leaders like Keir Starmer and Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron, I think there is a real understanding that this is not just about Ukraine, that there are very credible intelligence estimates that within 5 years of the end of a conflict in Ukraine, Russia would be in a position to attack another European country. So it's not an act of charity to backstop the line in Ukraine. It's about the future of European security, and it's about how you achieve that in a world where the United States, at least in its current iteration, and we just don't know what might be coming in a post-Trump world, can't be relied upon to be there.
Okay, it's interesting because what you're saying is that security guarantee that Ukraine would need if it were to partake in the so-called land swap, though of course they're not swapping any land really. It was all
right.
Ukrainian land.
Right, exactly. Yes.
That would have to come from Europe rather than the US, and yet the two men in the room so far, as we know, are going to be Trump and Putin.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is land that Trump is not in a position to give.
Yeah.
So it's bewildering, and honestly dismaying at this point in international politics that we seem to have learned so little about meetings taking place above the heads of the countries that are actually affected. And I mean, just the sheer optics of this, it's so damaging for the United States. I mean, Putin is who he is, and Russia is the country that it is. But for the United States to be partaking in this and to be potentially discussing giving parts of another sovereign country away, as far as we know, without that country's, if it was the case that Zelensky was encouraging Trump to do this and was empowering him on his behalf to go into a room with Putin and discuss this, then that would be one thing. But there's no indication that Zelensky is in anything other than a very difficult position here, where he has been shouted out of the Oval Office before. He's had intelligence and weapons cut off in the middle of a war before. It's going to take a lot of political skill for him too in the next few days to emerge from this without further distance between him and Washington. I think from his point of view, the best thing that could happen is if Putin overplays his hand, if Trump perceives him to be arrogant and to be playing him and to be just, in his words, feeding him a lot of bullshit, then there's an opportunity for Zelensky there. But, that side of this is relatively out of his hands, because that is going to come down to how Putin plays it and how Trump perceives that.
Okay, and just lastly, Katie, I mean, you're in Washington. I just wonder, you talked about the optics. I wonder how sort of politically it's going down that Trump, he's made these big claims about being sort of Mr. Peace, the person who could end this conflict in a day. And, it's not played out that way. And you have this taco narrative, Trump always chickens out. And, a lot of it seems to be bluster, even when he lands these big meetings with, America's adversaries, not much seems to come out of them. I mean, is that affecting him politically at all yet?
I think the problem is that we sort of lack a shared objective understanding of what's happening. So I think you certainly have a lot of former officials, including senior Republicans, who are dismayed that this is happening and who see Putin as really getting a lot of what he wants and who do not see this as the appropriate direction for foreign policy. Also, just the sheer what seems to be just rank incompetence of how we have arrived at this point is somebody like Steve Witkoff entering into these talks with Putin and emerging with a clearly very imperfect understanding of what was said. And like I said, maybe he was misled. Maybe this was all about just leading him up the garden path and then hanging him out to dry. So maybe this is not to do with how he went about these talks, but I think there is a lot of concern about some of the people who are now conducting these negotiations. This is not, in the previous Trump administration, you had people like Fiona Hill advising Trump on Putin, who is able to say, like, here's how he's manipulating you. Here's where his version of history is wrong. Here's where his historical grievances are. Here's what actually happened in this part of European history. A lot of those people have been pushed out or marginalized. So I think there's real concerns about who does have Trump's ear now and who is he listening to. But I think the problem is that for people who supported him and still support him, if you're perceiving this through the lens of Fox News or social media, probably what you're seeing is Trump doing something, bold, unprecedented, shaking up the way diplomacy's always been done. And people on the other side, like I say, are dismayed and deeply concerned. So I think there is a bit of a problem of a kind of choose your own adventure style of seeing what you want to see here. The one thing I would say that even some people who are pretty horrified by Trump in many respects will say is he will try things that have never been tried before. He doesn't have any concern for precedent or how diplomacy is normally conducted or how summits usually work. So I think that's about the most positive thing that you can find to say about it is he's certainly prepared to throw a lot of things at the wall. Although I would caveat that by saying the other side to that is then with apparently minimal preparation and very, I'm trying to find a diplomatic way to say it, but a very cursory understanding of the long and very complicated and very tortuous history of this subject. So all of which means that just having Trump and Putin sit down in a room would not seem to be a very sensible way to go about coming up with something that's, reasonable and likely to lead to a lasting peace agreement.